Hello and welcome to Passing the Torch, an online Bible study with your host and teacher, Bob Clark. Yeah, that's me. Today we are continuing on in our set of studies that we have entitled A Mosaic of Bible Prophecy. And today we're continuing on in study 2 out of what we think is going to be 8 studies. And study 2 is a brief history of Israel. We're still in the introduction lessons. Last time we talked about why study Jewish history in a set of lessons about end-time Bible prophecy. And we had a number of answers, so you can go back and watch that. Today we're talking about History 101, how to study history. The next time we will continue on and start actually into history. So a rough outline of what we'll talk about today. We're going to talk first about views of history. So for some famous people and some not so famous and how they viewed history. We'll talk about History 101 or how to study history. Really, how to study this Jewish history in these lessons. How are we going to approach it? And then we'll talk about an overview of Jewish timelines. As we go through this study, we will try to take most every event and put it into a timeline so you can see where it fits in with everything. But this time we'll talk about an overview of Jewish timelines. And then we'll end up with the resources that I'm using in the study, or some of many resources that I'm using in the study. All right? Views of history. So this is different people's perspective. As I said, some of these are famous, some not so famous, but let's see what they had to say about history. George Bernard Shaw said, "We learn from history that we learn nothing from history." So I don't want to dig a deep hole here, but I'm going to give you an example that we see right now in the news. Not to get too political about this, but I'm going to get a little political. So if we look in history, we see that every nation that adopted communism, it became evil. The people were persecuted, etc. It's an evil political schema, whatever the word is. And every one of these communist countries, they slid into it from so-called socialism. So what are we electing in a number of our cities in the United States right now? The primary city of capitalism for the world at the moment is New York City, and they just elected a socialist as mayor. People have forgotten the lessons of history. Aldous Huxley said that men do not learn very much from the lessons of history is the most important of all the lessons of history. True. George Santayana is probably the most famous quote along this line. Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. George Orwell, I like this quote, and I'm going to dig into it just a little bit here. Who controls the past controls the future. Who controls the present controls the past. So let's dissect it just a little, starting from the back. Who controls the present rhetoric, the present teaching and learning in the schools? Controls the past, what people learn about history. Who controls the past, that is what people have learned about history, that perspective controls the future. That's why paying attention to what our schools are teaching is so important. Aristotle, all right, famous philosopher. If you would understand anything, observe its beginning and its development. That's called history. Harry S. Truman. The only thing new in the world is the history you don't know. That's very similar to Solomon's "There's nothing new under the sun." Maya Angelou. So I like Maya Angelou because I like her perspective on many things, especially on history. And listen to this quote: "History, despite its wrenching pain, cannot be unlived. But if faced with courage, need not be lived again." So instead of, so many people wanting to tear down statues of Civil War leaders or even George Washington or Christopher Columbus, let's not do that. Let's remember who these people were, both good and bad. These people were not all good, they were not all bad. So let's remember history. This is from one of the not so famous people. That is from me. And as my kids went into school, I have told them this all their lives. History is the most important subject you can learn in school. No, it's not catchy like the rest of them, but it is true. And I am happy to say my children learned that lesson, and they know some parts of history better than I do. And I think that's a cool thing. What did Moses say about history? Deuteronomy 32:7 out of the New Living Translation. "Remember the days of long ago. Think about the generations past." That's called history. "Ask your father, and he will inform you. Inquire of your elders, and they will tell you." So even Moses says history is important. We need to remember these things. We need to remember what the people did, and in our case of studying Bible history, what did God do? Okay? As we study history, whether it's biblical or otherwise, we need to remember some certain things about that we are learning about actual people. This is not a fairy tale story. It's not mythology. We're learning about people. Do we have all the facts right? Maybe not. But it is actual people who had real emotions, love, hate, fear, who had reasons for their actions, love, hate, fear, greed, narcissism, who were imperfect. Yeah, even the saints. Everybody but Jesus. And we need to remember, no matter how much you learn about them, you are only seeing a very small part of the real story. Okay? On top of that, you are learning about their lives from somebody's perspective. Their own, maybe in an autobiography, somebody else's. Regardless, there's probably an agenda behind it. We need to remember those things. As we learn about history, we need to learn not to be skeptical. That's the wrong thing. Um, but to learn to question. There we go. To question. All right? And I could have put this quote on the previous slide, but I like this quote. "History is written by the victors." And we're going to see this. We're going to see this in Jewish history. Later on, in a later study, we'll see this in church history. History is written by the victors. So they can slant it any which way they want. And we need to recognize that as we go. As we learn about history, see yourself in their stories. What if I would have been there? And ask the questions of why. Not only that, ask the questions of what if? What if this event had not happened? What would have happened? What if this person had been killed at this time or had not been killed at this time? What would have happened? You can get into some very interesting things. Oh, are we going to know the answers? No. But it helps us to understand history. It helps us to understand the whys, why things happened. It gives us a perspective. All right? So, how should I tell you the stories of history? With timelines? With maps? Should we have stories about persons or descriptions about persons and people groups? Stories of events? Well, if we have the events, we've got to set it in time. Well, there's timelines. And set it in place. Well, that's maps. And it's typically based on specific persons or groups of people. In this study, I'm going to try to use all of these methods. I'm going to have timelines and maps and photos and descriptions and stories. Try to get it across. However, I will be upfront with you. It's not going to be consistent through this whole study because we're going to be covering 6,000 years of history almost. And hard to be consistent as we go because we know a lot more about some eras than we do others. But we're going to try to make this exciting as we go. No, the exciting part hasn't really started yet. Next time, all right? All right, so this thing about timelines. When was the start? That is, when was the creation of man? All right, next time we're going to talk about creation in general. But when we talk about timelines, we're talking about timelines of people in history. So the starting date, if you will, that we're interested in was the creation of man, not the creation of light, of sun, the moon, etc., but the creation of man. We'll talk about creation in general, like I said, next time. So, when was the creation of man? You may have seen this date before, because I've used this date before, and I used to think that this was somewhat authoritative, but in the 1650s, a guy by the name of Bishop James Ussher, he calculated creation as 4004 BC, based on his interpretation of the Bible. And over the years, others have added in small corrections here and there. I've seen a number of dates going back to 4014 and other things. Most of the corrections I've seen have been not in that date, but in other dates since then. At one point, his chronology of Bible events, of world history, was actually included in a lot of Bibles. And so from that, a lot of people assumed that it was very authoritative and accurate. Matter of fact, I think this is my first Bible that my parents gave me when I was 7 years old. And in the back of that, just like a lot of Bibles of this time period, there is that chronology from Bishop James Ussher. Now, just FYI, I looked it up. This Bible I got for Christmas when I was 7 years old. And it was it's King James. It is produced expressly for Sears, Roebuck and Company by the National Bible Press in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. So I think that's cool. In my mind, this is history. But that's the reason a lot of people took that 4004 as authoritative. All right, so let's look for a moment at the traditional Jewish calendar, and it estimates creation as 3760 BC. And it's based largely on the Seder Olam. That's a book. We'll eventually wind up talking a little bit about it, not too much, but it'll get mentioned later on. The Seder Olam, which has a lot of chronology and dating of things. However, we find out that the Seder Olam has a discrepancy of 165 years. We'll talk about it in the next chart. There's 165 years missing out of their history. For example, secular date for the destruction of the first temple is 586 or 587 BC. And I used to think, why couldn't I even remember whether it's 586 or 587? And I looked it up, and you'll find half the people say 586, another half say 587. So it's probably right there on the border between the two dates. the traditional Jewish date, according to this methodology that we're talking, instead of 586 or 7, it was 422 BC. It dates, so this traditional date or method dates the year 2025 as the Jewish year 5785. And at this point, I'm already into 2026, so that would be 5786. But is that right? Okay, there's another way of looking at it from a Jewish perspective, and that's the dating that we find in the Dead Sea Scrolls, sometimes called the Dead Sea Scroll calendar. It is based on the Bible and the Dead Sea Scrolls, specifically the book of Jasher, but some of the other Dead Sea Scrolls as well. It includes the lessons from the Seder Olam. And according to that, creation was 5925 BC. That's interesting. 3925 BC. So where can you find out about this? Dr. Ken Johnson, you can look him up, www.biblefact.org, or on YouTube. You can find his channel, YouTube at BibleFacts.org. A lot of excellent information about the Dead Sea Scrolls in general and about this Dead Sea Scroll calendar specifically. A lot of lessons that he has taught about that. This Dead Sea Scroll calendar, this chronology, matches the traditional Jewish calendar with the modification of the missing years in the Jewish chronology. It dates the year 2025 as the year 5950. And actually, let me be a little more specific. Right now, it is March 8th. When I'm teaching this is March 8th of 2026. On this calendar, we go from the year 5950 to the year 5951 in 10 days on March 18th. So March 18th of 2026 starts, I'm going to hold off on that, what I was about to say. All right, so let's talk about this, traditional Jewish chronology, and where did that 165 years go in that? I'm not going to go through all of this, but the bottom line is that Seder Olam overlooks numerous rulers that were known to secular history, resulting in the traditional chronology missing 165 years since the beginning. So in this chart, you can find this table in two different places on Wikipedia. You can see the top of the chart and get those locations. So things like not getting the correct number of years for Nebuchadnezzar and Amal Marduk. There's other places. There's a number of the Persian rulers that they totally skipped. And so it all adds up to 165 years missing. So that's the reason that I have no problem effectively ignoring the traditional Jewish dating. The Dead Sea Scroll dating, no, that's probably a lot more accurate because it matches. It matches the secular dating on when events happened. All right, so let's talk about this Jewish perspective of time. And we're gonna go through this. So think of this as a timeline that you're looking at. Let me see if I can get the cursor to show up. Yeah, there we go. All right, so this is using the Dead Sea Scroll start of or creation of man in the year 3925 BC. So we're going to see BC, before Christ. Some people use BCE, before the Common Era. But what was the Common Era? It was Jesus. So before Christ, okay? Now then, there's also Anna Mundi, which is from the creation. All right, so 0 Anno Mundi. All right, and this, like I say, this is according to the Dead Sea Scrolls. So that would mean that 2,000 years into this would have been 1925 BC. 4,000 years into this, 4,000 AM Anno Mundi would be 75 AD, Anno Domini, in the year of our Lord. And then 6,000 years would be the year 2075. So we're about 50 years from that right now. Now then, let's talk about this Jewish perspective of time. There are time periods from Jewish perspective. We have ages. An age is 2,000 years. So you see it on here. We start off with, from this first 2,000 years, what's called the age of chaos or the age of conscience. All right. The next 2,000 years was the age of the law. That's after Moses had given the law. The next 2,000 years is called the age of grace or the church age. You'll find that, okay, according to the Jewish perspective, this would be called possibly age of grace or the age of Mashiach, the age of the Messiah, because they believe, according to the scriptures, that the Messiah should have come somewhere around this 4,000 year mark. It's just they missed who he was. All right, so then you have one more 1,000 year period. It's called the kingdom age. We call it the millennium. All right, so ages is 2,000 year periods, right? Days is 1,000 years. And we talked about this during the introduction study. And we talked about the septimillennial theory, which is with the Lord, a day is as 1,000 years, 1,000 years as a day. So we have day 1 is 1,000 years long, day 2. This is from the 6 days of creation and the 7th day of rest from the book of Genesis chapter 1. All right. And there are almost all of the early Jewish sages, actually current Jewish sages as well, believe in this septimillennial theory. And you will find some of the early church fathers, a lot of the Bible prophecy teachers today, they believe in this septimillennial theory. I'm one of those. All right. So next we have 500-year periods called onas. Onas. So there's 500-year period, 500, 500, 500. Okay. Now, it just so happens that as we get into talking about Jewish history, we find that it breaks down pretty conveniently into 500-year periods. And each 500-year period has a name associated with it, at least once you get to this 75 AD period. All of these in here, they have names associated with each, Jewish names associated with each 500-year period. Next, we have jubilees. What is a jubilee? It's a 50-year period. Or think of it more like this. It is 7 7-year periods with a jubilee year following that. So that's what you're seeing here is the jubilees, 50-year periods. And then finally, we have shmitas, which are 7 years. So a jubilee is 7 shmitas followed by a jubilee year. And later on, as we need it, we may bring this up again and we can remind you of what all these things are. So, what we now understand from the Dead Sea Scroll calendars, and I get this straight from Ken Johnson, is that March 18th of 2026 starts the last 50-year period right here, if you can see it on the chart, before the 6,000th year. We're in that last Jubilee period. Matter of fact, up until March 18th, we're in the Jubilee year. But March 18th of 2026 starts that last Jubilee period before the 6,000th year. That may be, I think that's going to wind up being very important to us as we go. Let's keep going. All right. I know this chart is busy. This is a timeline of Jewish history. So okay, so starting over here, I'm going to go through it very quickly for now. We'll talk about it later in some later studies or lessons. All right, so we start off with the creation of Adam, right? And so we're going to use the Dead Sea Scroll dating of 3925. And then his son was Seth, his son was Enosh, Kenan, Mahalalel, Yared, Enoch, Methuselah, Lamech, and then it goes up here to Noah. Then his son was Shem. His son was Arpachshad, Shelah, Eber, Peleg, Reu, Serug, Nahor, Terah, and then to Abraham. Now, in the Bible, we have a good estimation of times from the creation of Adam until I believe it was is it the call of Abraham? No, until the birth of Jacob. All right? Until the birth of Jacob, we have very good understanding of the timing in all of this time frame. Then once you get to, that is in the Bible, once you get to the United Kingdom of Israel, that's King Saul, King David, King Solomon, from there until today, we have a very good understanding of time, of the chronology of those events. It is this time period between these two that we really have question marks over. So, because the Bible doesn't tell us how old Jacob was when his 12 sons were born. And I just threw in one. I just threw in Joseph here. And then you skip a few people, and Moses did not come from Joseph. Moses came from Levi. All right, but you get to Moses, he's an important person. And then we wind up after Moses, we have the period of the Judges. The United Kingdom, as I said, that's King Saul, David, and Solomon. Then the divided kingdom. The northern kingdom divided from the southern kingdom, Judah. The northern kingdom called Israel, southern called Judah. The northern kingdom of Israel was taken into captivity in the year 721 or 722 by Assyria. The southern kingdom stayed where it was until they were overrun by the Neo-Babylonian Empire under the rule of Nebuchadnezzar. You may have heard of the guy. Nebuchadnezzar's empire, the Babylonian Empire, was overrun by the Persian Empire, by Cyrus the Great. That empire was overrun later by the Greek Empire under Alexander the Great. And that empire, if you will, fractured, but it stayed Greek, or really Macedonian. And then that was overrun eventually by the Roman Empire. Roman Empire effectively, it divided in two, into the Roman Empire, Western Roman Empire, and the Eastern Roman Empire called the Byzantine Empire. But this is all part of the Roman Empire that stayed into existence until almost the year 1500. Okay, so let's come down here to go back to Jewish history, starting about the time of the destruction of the temple, about the time frame that Jesus was around. We have the Talmudic period. That's about 500 years, 600 years. The next is the Gaonic era, or Gaonic period. Next is the Reshanim period. And then we have the Acronym period. And other important things here is Israel being reestablished in 1948. All right. All right. So as we go to each lesson, we're going to have a chart up pretty close to the front that's going to be very much like this. And you can see in this, there's a timeline at the top where I have summarized what you just saw on the previous chart. So we have what's called the antediluvian period. What does the antediluvian mean? It means before the flood. So we see Adam, and I just hit a few people: Enoch, Methuselah, Noah, his son Shem, and then we have the period that's from the flood to Abram, who became Abraham. We have the patriarchs. We have the time period in Egypt when the Jewish people were in Egypt. We have the Exodus, Judges. And you see I have these boxes around each of these sections. That's sort of how we're going to approach this timeline. The pre-flood history, we're going to catch in, I think, a couple of lessons, and then we'll keep on going into talking about Abraham and such as that, or the flood and Abraham. All right. And then also, as part of this, you see that I have pulled out, this is where we're going to start off with, is this from the creation of Adam to the birth of Noah and back down to Abraham. And so we may have either a section of map or a section of timeline where we can isolate things. And then we will have a map. And so this is from worldhistory.org, and they have done an excellent job of creating maps throughout history, tied to timelines. And you really can't see it too well on the chart, but over here are dates. And so you can click on it, and it will pull up effectively any date in history that you want, and you can see what the world looked like. In this case, I've zoomed in on a lot of these maps. I've zoomed in this case, to show the area that we would call Turkey and Egypt, over to, that would be Iraq. This over here would be Iran, Syria in here. All right, so I've zoomed in, and Canaan is down here, or Israel is what it became. And so we'll highlight some famous cities. There's Ur of the Chaldees, some famous nations, Elam, which we'll wind up talking about, the Hittites we'll eventually talk about. But we will cover these things as we go, so you have an idea of when in history you are, specifics of that history, and where in history you are. I hope that helps to ground us as we go. Now then, where we're going to start off in history is, we're going to start off in Genesis, right at the beginning. We're going to start off with creation, right? And so on this chart, you can take a snapshot if you want to, a screenshot that is. On this chart, what I have done is I have the chapters out of Genesis, and I've created an outline of the book of Genesis. And over on the side is a vertical timeline, so that you can see approximately when each of these chapters and stories took place. All right, and I'm not going to dig a big hole into it right now. You can take a screenshot and have it for future reference. So this is an important chart, and probably one of the most important charts out of this lesson. How do we turn head knowledge into heart knowledge? Okay, it's one thing to learn history, but this is a Bible study. We're trying to learn not just history, but we're trying to learn about the Bible. We're trying to learn about God. We're trying to learn about the relationship of God to his people, including us. So how do we turn head knowledge that we learn in history class, history lesson, into heart knowledge? Good question. We start off by reflecting on God's actions and his character through these parts of history. Okay, so we go through a story, an event, whatever. We found out this is what happened. Look what God did in that. Okay? Well, we reflect on that. What did God do? Why did he do that? Why did he do it that way? How did he arrange that? Because we're going to find out there's some stuff that he did in David's day, King David's day, which is, okay, ballparkish, 1000 BC, affected what happened in Queen Esther's day ballpark is 400 BC. There are connections there 600 years apart that if David had not done some things then, it would not have shown up later on with Esther. What character of God was revealed? And we're going to see over and over, it's his love for his people. That includes the Jewish people, and it includes Christians, those that accept God, accept Jesus as who he is. How was this event impacted by earlier events? I just told you one of those with David and Esther, and we'll talk about it when we get there. What future events does this event enable? So how do we turn head knowledge into heart knowledge? By mixing our updated understanding of God with faith. Hebrews 4, verse 2. For indeed the gospel was preached to us as well as to them. But the word which they heard did not profit them, not being mixed with faith in those who heard it. So we want to, as we learn about God in these stories, we want to mix that with faith. So, resources. All right, I'm going to try to do this quickly because I'm running long, I think. Resources for Jewish history. Where do I get this from? Well, let's start with the Bible, plus biblical notes. So in this case, we got Dake's annotated Bible. So yes, I've studied the Bible all my life, or essentially all my life. So well over 50 years now. I'm 62. 62? Yes, I'm 62 now. And so I've studied the Bible for probably 52, 54 years, something like that. Dake's notes are awesome. They're not all correct, but I learned so much. It makes me think, even though they may not be correct in some cases. Not only that, Ryrie's study notes. Charles Ryrie was an amazing Bible teacher. Are the notes all correct? No, they're not. But I learned so much from it. So what else? How about this book? The New Complete Works of Josephus. You may have heard of Josephus, Flavius Josephus. Just putting it bluntly, he was a traitor to the Jewish people. He turned to be a historian, documentarian for the Romans and to save his life. But this is the reason we know so much about history, is because he wrote down so much of history. Now, have I read this whole thing? Absolutely not. Look how thick that is. There's over 1,100 pages. I haven't read it. But when I'm listening to somebody else, they say, Josephus says such and such, I can go and look it up. World History Atlas. So remember in the previous chart, I showed you a map. That came from that World History Atlas. It's very, very good set of maps. Is it perfect? No, it's not. I'm thinking of one thing in particular. Because archaeologists and historians still study, or still argue about some of these dates, especially the dates of the Exodus. Wikipedia. Yes, I know school teachers hate Wikipedia. For my purposes, it's fantastic because I can go and look up the pieces of history that I need without having to without having to read the whole book at a time. All right? And there's some cases, some of these charts that we go into, that I'm going to do a lot of quoting from Wikipedia, either quoting or just changing their words. I'm going to try to give them credit every place I remember to do that. Online, www.kabod.org has a lot of excellent information about Jewish history in very simplified terms. It's very good to learn these things. www.templemount.org. So the templemount.org sounds like it's very Jewish. and it is slanted towards Jewish, but it's a Christian website. So it gives a Christian perspective on Jewish history. All right, so Rabbi Ken Spiro, I'm not exactly sure how to pronounce it. He has Crash Course in Jewish History, and it can be found on AIS. Okay, so I've always just spelled it AISH.com. I think it's actually pronounced Aish.com. Aish.com has a lot of things about Jewish history, Jewish culture. The last that I looked, they still had the camera up showing the Western Wall live. It's a pretty neat site. But Ken Spiro is also on YouTube. And so this is my printing out his notes for Crash Course in Jewish History. That was printed off many years ago now. Okay, talking about online, especially on YouTube, David Solomon is a great Jewish history teacher. I learned a whole bunch, the 500-year periods and talking about the acronym and the Rishonim and such as that. I got that from him. Excellent Jewish history teacher. So the Dead Sea Scrolls, and okay, I can't read the languages that they wrote the Dead Sea Scrolls in, so I get my information from Dr. Ken Johnson. And I have several books from him, or at least a couple of them, and this one is one of those, Ancient Testaments of the Patriarchs, where he has actually went into the Dead Sea Scrolls and did the interpretation himself. So you can find his information on BibleFacts.org or on YouTube at BibleFacts. Excellent source of information. He teaches live every Monday night. So excellent source of information. All right. Bruce Gore is another one of those that I found him on YouTube. YouTube at Gore Bruce. And he wrote a book that is Historical and Chronological Context of the Bible. Excellent historical context for the Bible. He actually did it. He retired from being a lawyer and went into being a high school teacher. And one of the first classes they put him in charge of was teaching the Bible in context, or teaching historical context for the Bible. There was no textbook, so he wrote one. What else do we have here? Denny Sissom. This is one of my favorites, and I have a reason why. Denny Sissom, I found him also on YouTube. And so on YouTube at Denny Sissom. And he also wrote a book called The Bridge to the New Testament, a comprehensive guide to the forgotten years of the intertestament period. This is fantastic. Sounds like fantasy. This is amazing information that he has in here. He worked on this for, I don't know exactly how many, I think the better part of 20 years, and has an awful lot of information in there that is excellent. One of the things I found out in this study is how important it is for us understanding the New Testament to understand what happened between the Old and New Testament. And that's what his book is about and his teachings are about. So there's resources, some of the resources that I used for this study on Jewish history. Others from books and online, and trying to think of one. The Casual Historian on YouTube has a lot of excellent information. A number of others. So, as I said last time, I'm going to try to put this chart in every one of these lessons. Important takeaways, because I know we've been all over the place, right? So what are the important things to take out of this? Bible history is Jewish history. Events in history and the Bible take on meaning in the setting of time, location, and persons/people groups. So events and people and location and time. It's all related, okay? Some dates in biblical history are known relatively accurately, while others are disputed by good theologians and good archaeologists. The study of history is a study of real people with real emotions and real reasoning. So because of that, we can put ourselves into that of, well, how would we have reacted the same, differently, or whatever? What would our reasonings be? Nothing in the Bible is there by accident. It's all connected, and we're going to see that as we go. And finally, this study on Jewish history will support your learning of the Bible and biblical context, even if you don't enjoy talking about end times prophecy, because we're really not going to go too much into prophecy. We're going to set things up for it. But it really is what has already happened. And we'll hit the prophecy every once in a great while. So today we finished our introduction to a brief history of Israel. Next time we'll finally get into this first, instead of jumping into a 500-year period, we're going to do the first 2,000 years. So this will be creation to, or the time period will be creation to the flood, and actually a little bit beyond the flood. And we will tackle that starting next time with the creation. And we'll actually have a couple of lessons, a part 1 and a part 2, talking about creation, the gap theory, and other possibilities. So if you've never heard of the gap theory, that's what we'll talk about. If you have heard of the gap theory, that's still what we're going to talk about. But we'll throw in, there's some other explanations for understanding the timing for creation and such as that. We'll mention some of those others as well. But you do not have to believe the gap theory to come along with us. Understand what other people think as well. Because we're going to try to throw in a number of different perspectives on creation and the timing of creation. So with that, I hope to see you here next time on Passing the Torch. So long.